Where do we get the day of the week? Tuesday. It is, of course, because of the Anglo Saxon god Tiw, better known by his Norse counterpart, Tyr, god of war, but also maybe the sky. So we're going to go on a little deity track today, and we're going to follow this divinity back through the labyrinth of time and human culture and see, is this the original Indo-European Skyfather? Let's go. So before I begin this little delve into the god Tiw, or Tyr, or Tiwaz, I'd just like to thank one of my Patreons, Jack, who has commissioned this video. And he was wondering if the Norse god Tyr, as we receive him in later Norse mythology, may have originally held a more prominent position in a kind of Proto-Germanic Pantheon before he got usurped by everyone's favourite one-eyed god Odin, or Wodenaz. In short, I think that possibly or probably is the case, yeah, but I don't think it's the whole story. I think there's another Norse god that might have stolen Tyr's thunder, if you know what I mean. So let's have a little look into this. So first though, what is usually said about the god Tyr? Tyr in the Norse, Tiw in the Anglo Saxon. Well, these things broadly are said of Tiw. He is often said to be the god of war. He's sometimes considered a sky god, perhaps earlier. He's very much considered to be a god of justice, of oaths, of doing the right thing, of the law, of the ting, of the council. He's also said to be the sword god. He's the god of courage. That's said again and again and again. He's the courageous god. He is the god that decides who wins in battle, who is victorious. He's a victory god, you could say. He's also, of course, associated with the wolf, and he is the one-handed god, because his right hand, his oath-giving hand, has been eaten by the great Wolf Fenrir, according to Norse mythology. So, if you're not familiar with this myth, it's one of the very few myths where we have the god Tyr really appearing, because he's strangely absent from later Norse mythology. I told this story on this channel last week. I'll put a link to it, but in brief, the gods have got a problem in Asgard. The problem is, of course, the children of Loki, the Midgard serpent, the goddess Hela, and the question here is the wolf Fenrir, who just keeps growing larger and larger. And Tyr is said to be the only god courageous enough to feed him. I interpret that there's a bit of a bond there between man and wolf. There's an unspoken bond. I think that's unsaid in the prose edda, but I think it's there. And essentially, this wolf gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the gods keep trying to bind this wolf. And eventually, they manage it. They go to the dwarves to make a magic chain, and Fenrir asks to keep things kosher that one of the gods put their hand inside his mouth as a sign of good faith. And of course, Tyr is the one to do that because he's raised this wolf, but he's also the god of oaths, of acting in good faith, of doing the right thing. Of course, Fenrir can't break out of the chains, and he bites off Tyr's hand, and forever Tyr is known as the one-handed god. So that's the main myth concerning Tyr in Norse mythology. And again, if you want to hear that myth, check it out. I've told it on this channel before. I'll put a link to it at the end of this video as well if you want to hear me tell it in the vein of a storyteller. There are other myths involving Tyr as well. Arguably in the prose, in the poetic edda, so a bit earlier, there's a slightly daft adventure story where Thor and Tyr go to the realm of giants and nick a big cauldron, or win a cauldron, to brew some ale for the gods, and there's some trickery involved. Some people cast a bit of shade on whether this is actually Tyr. Some people, because one word for Tyr, I'll get onto this in a moment, is just God. Tyr just means God in Old Norse, in many old Proto-Indo-European languages and Indo-European language families. So it might not be Tyr, it might be another god, might be Loki. Loki's normally the god that goes on gianty exploits with Thor. So who knows? It's also interesting that Tyr's dad in this myth is the giant Heimir, whereas in the prose edda he's the son of Odin, and in various places Tyr is called the prince of temples, so very much more of an aristocratic role rather than a sort of giant spawn. So mixed signals here from the prose and the poetic eddas. As a sort of caveat here, right? A lot of Norse mythology we get from the prose edda, from very late Icelandic material, all compiled by one dude, Snorri Sturluson. I'm sure a lot of you guys know this already, but I think we've got to be very, very careful with that, because compilers of myth, folklorists in general, all through history, whether it's the 13th century or the 19th century or today, they like to put their own contemporary lens on it. In Snorri's case, obviously a Christian lens, but also more than that, they tend to tidy. Myth is messy, right? It's also difficult for the waking mind to really apprehend, because the language of myth is the language of dream, right? It follows very strange logic. So quite often, I even as a folklorist feel this impulse myself. Quite often the impulse is, oh, this can't be right, this is too weird, let's just tidy that up and make it more logical. And actually you're doing a disservice to the spirit of the myth and probably altering it in ways in which it was not originally intended. I sometimes think that the Aboriginal concept of dream time might apply here. These myths are somehow out of time and they work on a different level to the rational mind. That's a topic I've approached many times on this channel. But going back to Tyr, then, he's in a funny old position. We're not quite sure why he plays such a small part in Norse mythology. If we want to get a bit of an insight into what Tyr might have been earlier, perhaps before the Viking Age, before Norse Age, maybe more in the Iron Age, the Germanic Iron Age, and maybe in a broader northern context, you know, forget Germanic and Celtic. As we go further back in time, these two peoples tend to be less distinct from each other, both in terms of language and culture, right? So if we want to know a little bit more about this god Tyr, or Tiw in the Anglo Saxon, we're going to have to look at etymology a little bit. So Tyr, as I suggested earlier, basically means God. It can be related right back to theorized Proto-Indo-European language that connects German and Celtic and Indian languages all together. And it basically means God or day. It's basically where we also get the term Zeus from. It's also where we get the word day, God, a celestial, all these sorts of words to do with the heavens and deity. It's interesting that Tiw or Tyr is exactly cognate with Zeus, because Zeus is kind of a different god. Zeus is a thunder god and also a sky god and also the king of the gods, right? He's kind of a big deal. We would normally equate Zeus to Thor, or maybe we'd equate his son Hercules to Thor, if we're going to do mythological comparisons, which I think we should kind of tread carefully if we're going to do that, because there's always cultural and temporal differences, all right? That just goes without saying. But yeah, Zeus is more like Thor, not Tyr. And even as I say that, it's so interesting that the word Thor and Tyr are so similar. They're not etymologically connected as far as I'm aware, but it's just one of those interesting synchronicities of language. Yeah, so if we go further back, it's possible that Tyr was a sky god and kind of the big shot of all the gods in some kind of theorized earlier Proto-Indo-European pantheon. When we reconstruct Indo-European pantheons, so just as a like really brief foray into Indo-European, these were a group of people, basically all of our ancestors in Europe, more or less, that swept across Europe, replacing earlier cultures like the megalith builders, like the Western hunter-gatherers that were there before. And they brought with them, this is gross oversimplification, but they brought with them a host of sky gods and male deities, and also a very kind of arguably paternalistic, hierarchical social structure. They were herders. They brought new technology as well, bronze working, chariots, horsemanship, all these things that basically allowed them to completely roll over the farming communities that existed in India and Persia and Europe at the time. That's a really oversimplistic picture. But when we reconstruct their religion, of which all of our European pantheons have kind of evolved out of, arguably, whether Greek or Norse or Celtic or Baltic or Slavic, what we do is we've got a few kind of archetypes in this Indo-European pantheon. We've got a sky god, just literally the dome of the sky, the heavens, like up there. And then we've got another god, which may or may not be the same god, depending on when and where we are. We've got a god sort of under that seems to be more of an atmospheric god, like a weather god, thunder, lightning, rain, thus also fertility. We've also got a kind of war god who may or may not be related because lightning strikes. So he's like the striking god. Sometimes the god of chariots. This is typically the Thor kind of archetypal role. The god of whacking stuff. There may also be separate to that, not just a sort of champion whacking god, but more of a martial sort of, war, like more of the concept of war god. I reckon the Indo-Europeans had a lot of war-like gods because they were arguably quite warlike. That is kind of up for debate. They might have just kind of migrated into Europe rather than bashing everything on the head, but maybe little from column A, little from column B. So a lot of male gods, also probably earth god, maybe earth goddess as well, but just a host of very male, alpha male sort of gods. And at different times, this is the thing with tracking deities, you can never really it's like trying to measure quantum particles. They never quite stay still. You can't quite pinpoint them. Gods travel from place to place, and they might merge with other local gods, or they might split into many gods, or a local god might come through, or all this sort of stuff. So it's very difficult to say this god remains the same through time and is related to that one, and that god is the same as that one. The deities are like processes, just like humans, all right? So as an example of this, let's look at a European, a Celtic deity, Taranis. Taranis means thunder, or also possibly striking. You could say he's directly a direct ancestor to Thor in a way, because Thor is the thunder god. Also Zeus, he's kind of in that area. But he's also probably a sky god, and also a chariot god, and also a god of war. He's kind of all of these male paternalistic archetype gods I've just mentioned rolled into one together. The chariot wheel, by the way, usually symbolizes a thunder and lightning, and also the disk of the sun. So he's kind of a solar god as well. You see what I mean? Sky, also lightning, also moving forward and striking, also war. So Taranis is sort of everything. So maybe Tyr, a bit like Taranis, was just top dog, top god, and his attributes got divvied up at some point when we moved into Germania and up into Scandinavia, probably before these gods moved up into Scandinavia. So I would say that Thor actually has borrowed, has absorbed a lot of the attributes that possibly once were attributed to Tyr or Tiwaz. What further complicates this is that Thor is also arguably a sky god as well, a sky father, even though he's not the all-father. Which brings me on to Odin, or Woden. This is one of these things that really fascinates me. Why the hell is the magician archetype the king of the gods? We don't really get that anywhere else. We don't get that in Greece and Rome. You wouldn't put Mercury at the top of the pile. It's odd that in the northern regions, not just Scandinavia, but Britain and Gaul as well, right? Mercury is sort of the most popular deity, not necessarily the king of the gods. So if we're going to look at historical evidence on this, Tacitus is one of the best. When the Romans encountered both the Gaulish, the Celtic, and the Germanic tribes, they said the most popular god is Mercury. They did a thing called the Interpretaria Romana. You know, they interpreted foreign barbarian gods in terms of their own. I guess you could call it kind of cultural colonialism in a way. But it's good that they did, because now we know something about those gods. But Tacitus said Mercury, he was top dog, top god. Not necessarily the king of the gods, but he was most worshipped. He was given human sacrifices. And then there's Hercules, Zeus Hercules, that's Thunor, and Mars, or Ares. Those three. So that is Tyr, Thor, and Odin, or Woden, Thunor, and Tiw, if you're going to use the Anglo Saxon, which I like to because I'm English and I don't think they get enough love. The point I'm making is that the magician archetype, the god of the dead as well, the psychopomp of the god, the messenger god, is top god. I touch on this a little bit on my Horned God video that I'll put a link to, but that's really interesting. And I think it's probably, there's some reason for that. I theorize, I'm not the only one that theorizes this, but I think probably there was a much older deity, a kind of shamanic god that might go right back to the Bronze Age, maybe even the megalith builders, maybe even the Western hunter-gatherers, because we see that, maybe even way back to the Mesolithic, because we sometimes see shamanic deer-headed kind of ritualistic objects and evidence from grave burials that suggests that the shaman or magician archetype in terms of a deity might have been really important, and also perhaps tied to aristocracy. And maybe that's why that god, even though these Indo-European sky gods have kind of rolled over Europe, this earlier indigenous European god has kind of seeped through and to become the All-Father. And then the thunder god, Thor, comes through and is just very, 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 very popular. So he's kind of there. And then the old Sky Father is kind of demoted down to third place and maybe just given the attribute of god of war, even though all Norse gods are kind of gods of war. Does that sort of make sense? That's the way I look at it. What do you think? So in answer to your question, Jack, I think yes, probably Tyr was way more important and was probably more God with a capital G, possibly to certain pre-Norse and even pre-Germanic or pre-European peoples. But his attributes have been divvied out to later Norse gods and even perhaps pre-existing local gods. Again, it's difficult because we're relying so much on late medieval material and then peering through that like a lens to the darkness of the Viking Age. Speaking of Celts, there's another one-handed god. If you know his name, put it in the comments now before I say it. This is really, really interesting comparison. So we get this from the Irish mythology. He's also found in archaeology in Britain, arguably. His name is Nuada, and he too is the prince of the king of the gods, of the Tuatha De Danann. And he too only has one arm. Just in brief, Nuada led the Tuatha De Danann to Ireland, and they defeated the native race of giants or demons or supernatural entities, the Firbolga. But in that mighty battle, in one-on-one combat, because that's how the northern peoples did it, not like these pesky Romans with their, you've got to do one-on-one combat with the king of the other army, then everyone else fucks off, right? Whoever loses. So they had a fight, and Nuada got his arm severed by the king of the Firbolga, whose name was, I forget. But ultimately Nuada won. So the Firbolga were defeated. The Tiwaz today become the kings and queens of Ireland. But Nuada can no longer rule because he's no longer perfect. This is such a Germanic and Celtic Iron Age thing, I think. The idea of that a king has to be perfect. And because of his nobility, he steps down. And then a tyrant breast takes his place. And then there's a big battle with the Fomorians. I've told this story on this channel with Balor of the Burning Eye. But basically, Nuada is given a silver arm. So his arm is replaced so he can fight again. And ultimately, Lu or Lugus succeeds him. And then, yeah, we could get into, is Lugus cognate with Loki or not? And this whole kind of solar cycle thing. But the point is, Nuada also is related to ideas of justice and honor and doing the right thing. And this is what we still get, I feel, in the myth of Tyr and Fenrir, when he does the right thing by putting his hand in that wolf's mouth, even though it's also the wrong thing because he's betrayed his mate, the wolf, arguably. That's why Loki says to Tyr in the Lokasana, you know, wherever you go, you cause discord wherever you go. That could be because of the whole wolf thing, or it could be because of Tyr's original role as this war god, as this champion god, as this smasher of other people. Yeah, a bit about Nuada there as well, a bit of a Celtic parallel to Tyr, possibly. Maybe there's a link there. But Tyr is also possibly connected to the night sky as well as the daytime sky. There's a little hint to this in the Old English rune poems that I'll get onto. But Nuada also is possibly connected to the night sky. Certainly his British counterpart, Nodens from Roman Britain, is associated with night and water and the moon. Nuada's silver arm is possibly a lunar symbol. So maybe there's a link there. Maybe it's a night sky male deity. So the rune poems I have here in my pockets. Do I? So this here is the rune of Tyr. Probably. So all the runes have names. If anyone tells you runes are just phonetic sounds and just letters and don't have any semantic value, in a nutshell, they're wrong. I'll make a video about that in the future. I'll put it here. But all the runes, as well as just being letters, also have names and meanings. This rune is called Tiwaz. Okay, we slightly reconstructed that name in terms of the Elder Fuduk, but this rune is associated with the god Tyr. In the prose, in the poetic Edda, there's a bit where a Valkyrie is talking to Siegfried, and she is giving all the meanings of the runes, and she's saying, carve victory runes on your sword for victory, and call the name of Tyr twice. Okay, it's arguable that we don't know that it's this rune, and Tyr might be referring to any old god, but probably, I would say, like 90% likelihood, it's referring to this rune. We haven't found this symbol on a lot of actual swords, but we do find this rune as a double, as a bind rune in the archaeological record on magical amulets, like the Lindhorn amulet. So we do get this rune used singularly in a magical context. So this probably is a victory rune. Again, tying into this idea of Tyr being a victory god, a god that decides who wins in battle. It's also, you could argue, the symbol for a spear. That's how it's usually taken, which is difficult, actually, because Tyr is meant to be the sword god. Very different weapons. Tricksters use spears or javelins. They're dishonorable weapons in a way because you strike at range. That's why Odin uses a spear. That's why Lu in the second battle of Matora uses a spear against the Fomorians. It's a tricky weapon, whereas a champion, an Iron Age king, has to use a sword. That's an aristocratic weapon. You're face to face with your enemy. It's an honor thing, right? But in the rune poems, in the Icelandic and Norwegian rune poems, this rune is associated with Tyr, the leavings of the wolf, the Icelandic rune poem says. So this clearly, Tyr and the wolf is an old myth. The leavings of the wolf and the prince of temples. That's what the rune poems say about this rune. The Old English rune poem, which mentions Mars, that's one of the reasons why we equate Tyr with Mars, also equates it with the North Star, as in this is a guiding rune. So Tyr could be a god of guidance, of directionalism, of heading north from where the Indo-Europeans came from, heading north, you know, like the bloody Magi. So a rune of finding your way, of following the right path like a compass, doing the right thing. All those associations are coming to me, and these aren't just personal ones. These are shared by many. Some are from the rune poems, some are more subjective. But yeah, an association with the North Star, an association with the god Mars, an association with the wolf, all in the old rune poems for this rune. The rune of victory here. It's also in, I think, the Norwegian rune poem associated with smithing, of beating out a weapon. So again, it's the weapon rune. As I mentioned earlier, the Indo-Europeans, they brought in a lot of new technology, particularly Bronze Age technology, which must have been really magical when it first came along and ensured a lot of victory. So it's no wonder that the sword god is associated with this rune. So that's a little bit about Tyr for you there. Really fascinating deity. So here's something interesting to leave you with. In the Sutton Hoo burial, this is a Anglo Saxon king, possibly King Redwald. I talked about this on my Horned God video, but there's a brooch. I'll put an image of it on the screen. It shows a god. His head looks a bit like the sun. He's got two eyes, not one, and he's being eaten by two wolves. Some people suggest this is Odin, or Woden, because it's Anglo-Saxon, and others suggest that it's Tyr. Both gods are eaten by canines in Ragnarok. Odin, of course, is swallowed by Fenrir at the end of days, and Tyr is said to be eaten by the hellhound, Gamar, who guards the gates of hell. It's kind of like a Norse Cerberus. This is weird that these two gods are both eaten by canines. I think this is because Ragnarok is a late composite myth composed by Snorri Sturluson that cobbles together lots of ancient Indo-European gods. And the theme here is the great god of the sun, the god of everything, being swallowed up temporarily by perpetual darkness before re-emerging again. It's part of the cyclic nature of myth. And I think Tyr and Odin have been split apart, and that's why they're both eaten by a dog. But actually, these were the same deity, and this is reflected in the Anglo-Saxon brooch. That's why two dogs are eating this sort of solar god here, who incidentally has both eyes and both hands. So I reckon this was a sort of Tiw Woden. That's just my idea. Anyway, if you want it on a t-shirt, I've got it on my Redbubble store. It's right here. My friends, thank you so much. Thank you, Jack, for asking me to make this video. If any of you guys want to commission a video for me, either on an aspect of mythology or on a particular story, then just then click on my Patreon. You can follow me for as little as $3 a month. Thank you so much, all of my new Patreons that have gone recently. That means a huge amount to me. Finally, the god Tyr, this arrow, also the god of chariots, like I mentioned. So I'm going to drive home now in my chariot. I've taken my gran out for lunch today. It's fucking cold, so I'm going home. Love you all. Here's another video.